think we'll start with this.
Hey there, I'm Mike. This is Crash Course Theater, and today is going to be a tragedy. A Greek tragedy, which is a lot like a regular tragedy, only older and with more stuffed Greek leaves. We'll be exploring Aristotle's theories on this art form, written more than a century after the golden age of Athenian drama. Then we'll apply them retrospectively to the only surviving tragic trilogy we have, the Orestia of Aeschylus. Get ready for some husband killing, some mother killing, and, maybe unsurprisingly, the invention of the jury trial. Meet Aristotle. Just Aristotle, no last name, like Cher, but older. Also believes in life after love, though. He was born in 384 BCE and lived in Greece and Macedonia. He spent many years studying with Plato, a philosopher who wasn't a big fan of drama or poetry. Plato wrote that poets encourage a false vision of reality and should be excluded from the ideal state. Ugh, harsh, dude. Luckily for us, his pupil Aristotle was a little more open-minded. In 335 BCE, a little while after he'd finished tutoring Alexander the Great, Aristotle sat down to write the Poetics, the first substantial work of literary criticism. Originally, the Poetics was in two parts, a section on tragedy and a section on comedy, but only the tragedy part survives. Aristotle was writing 200 years after City Dionysia really got going, and 150 years after the beginning of the golden age of Greek drama. So, the Poetics isn't really about analyzing contemporary work. It's about looking at the work that came before Aristotle, deciding what's great about it, and providing a handbook for future playwrights and audiences. Aristotle was basically trying to stick it to Plato by proving that poetry and theater could be useful to society. He was a big fan of Sophocles, and the rules Aristotle set out apply most closely to Sophocles' own Oedipus Rex, which you might remember from Crash Course Literature. Clubfoot, murder, incest, stabbing out the eyes. It's memorable stuff, but Aristotle's theories apply in many ways to all of the works of Greek tragedy. And often we can gain a lot of insight through how ancient plays do or do not tick the boxes that Aristotle set up. And in fact, Aristotle's theories continue to influence how we write and think about modern plays. First off, the tragedy portion of Aristotle's Poetics considers several forms of poetry, including the tragedy and the epic, which is different in that it's mostly descriptive rather than imitative. It tells rather than shows, like the Dithy rocks we discussed last episode. But we're here to talk tragedy, which Aristotle defines as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not narrative, through pity and fear, affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. So, okay, a lot of this language is ambiguous, but there are some conclusions we draw. We're going to go bit by bit. What does serious mean? Well, there probably aren't a lot of satyrs or phalluses. Complete, each play in a tragedy has to stand independent from other works in its trilogy. That's lucky for us because, as we discussed last time, invading hordes have a bad habit of burning libraries, and we've lost a lot of plays of a certain magnitude. That's trickier, but if you read Greek tragedies, you'll notice they deal with legendary heroes or royal families, characters whose lives will have a sizable impact. Also, their difficulties are not minor. These are stories about murder, vengeance, betrayal. Again, memorable stuff. By language embellished, Aristotle means not only poetry, but also song. The form of action, not narrative, means showing rather than telling, and through pity and fear, affecting the proper purgation of those emotions. That's catharsis, and as we suggested last episode, it's kept scholars fearful and piteous for centuries. We offered one explanation last time, that plays help make people better citizens by purging them of emotion unhelpful to the state. You have to cry at the theater so that you're not crying when it comes to making political decisions. But scholars have argued that this catharsis is actually supposed to happen for the characters on stage. There's been a lot of debate about whether the goal of catharsis is an emotional purgation or an intellectual clarification. Is catharsis supposed to awaken your emotions or trigger some deeply rational thoughts? Shockingly, much in that order, although he does say that song matters more than spectacles. Take that, projection designers. Wait a minute. I've designed projections. You don't want too much spectacle, he says, because that's cheap, and tragedy should be enjoyable, but not, like, too enjoyable. And Aristotle argues that even though it's characters we care about, it's actually the plot, the tragic action, that's most important. You can have a character just like Oedipus, for instance, who doesn't kill his father or marry his mother, but, well, that's not really a tragedy. Aristotle believes that in order for a tragedy to really work, it needs to focus on a mostly good character who, through the tragic action, is then brought low. If you have a mostly bad character brought low, big whoop, they had it coming, no tragedy. Same goes for a mostly good character who stays good. No pity, no fear, no catharsis. An unimpeachably good character brought low doesn't work either, because the tragic action has to be their fault, at least a little. Aristotle writes that the ideal is to have a mostly noble and illustrious character whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity, but by some error or frailty. The word for frailty in Greek is hamartia. It's a term that comes from archery, and it means missing the mark. Our tragic character doesn't have some horrible inborn flaw, but more like tries to do a good job and whiffs it. Aristotle thought that a tragic plot needed to have three main elements: reversal, recognition, and a scene of suffering. The Greek word for reversal is peripeteia. You might recognize it from the English word peripatetic, which means walking back and forth. Reversal means just when you think something's going okay, there's a change, usually signaled by the arrival of a messenger, and then everything just gets terrible again, and someone has to start shooting those messengers. It's the only way to solve this problem. Recognition, known as anagnorisis, is what happens when a character finally recognizes something. That was my mother! That was my son! I shouldn't have eaten that second piece of cake! Recognition combined with the reversal is best, Aristotle says. It automatically produces pity or fear, maybe even both. Shortly after recognition comes the scene of suffering, exile, suicide, huge psychological trauma. It's fun stuff, and just the kind of thing that a healthy city-state would want to sponsor for the good of its people. To get a feel for some of these elements, let's take a quick look at the Orestia, the only surviving Greek tragedy trilogy, which won first prize.
Okay, we are not going to look at Orestia. However, we are going to look at King Lear. So I do want to just let you all know that we took Aristotle's, I would say, very complex theory and tried to break it down into smaller portions that are a little bit more manageable. So first and foremost, when we're studying tragedy, I would say if you ever read Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Rex, that would be like the ultimate, the paradigm, the number one. Everything else kind of falls under that category of not quite being a full representation. But when we look at the classic tragic heroes, especially Shakespeare's tragedies, there's a lot that we can draw parallels to. So to begin with, we've already looked at the definition. We are going to see the imitation of action of life in dramatic form. It is serious. There are moments that I would say might be a little bit comedic. I mean, if you think of an old man running around in a field naked with like a Coachella flower crown, that might be humorous to us, but when we're really looking at the fact that he's been driven to absolute madness because of the treatment he's received from his daughters, you see where the pity and the fear kind of emerges, right? So the whole concept of tragedy is that we are supposed to learn something beyond ourselves. And we're also supposed to develop this catharsis, this emotional release from watching the tragedy. And the idea is that we learn some sort of lesson and we're able to self-reflect. That's the goal. The classic tragic hero. So if you look at Shakespeare's plays, all of them are about men, okay? It's a person of a high social status. It's always a man. It's a king, a prince, a political leader, a general. It is never going to be an average person, a teacher, a doctor. That's not it. Okay? It's always someone better than ourselves. And essentially, his fate affects the fate of the society that he lives in. So oftentimes in Shakespeare's plays, when the person at the top of the chain that we had discussed a little bit yesterday, the great chain of being, when the person at the top makes some sort of critical mistake or something bad happens to them, it impacts society from the very top, the kings, all the way to the very bottom, the peasants. Okay. So this concept is that his fall is treated with seriousness. It's not something that we look at to be funny. So what's important here is that Macbeth, he's kind of the one guy that might stick out a little bit differently. But no matter how misguided or evil he becomes, the hero must be well-intentioned at the beginning of the story. Okay, so we will have to judge King Lear on his decision. Was this ultimately was he doing this out of a good intention? I think he was doing his decision was based on selfish intentions. But when you look at someone like Macbeth, I don't know if you could ever say that really to be ambitious to the point where you're going to usurp a king is ever, a properly guided decision. So this error in judgment, right, like missing the mark, is the hamartia. Another word for hamartia or hamartia is the tragic flaw. Something, an amplified quality in the tragic hero they can't change. They can't go back from making a decision that they made. Okay, so these people, yes, they are better than us, but they are not perfect. They might have very good qualities, but these things, whether it's errors in judgment, errors in decision, all of these things funnel down to where Aristotle would argue is the ultimate sort of failure of humans, or man in particular, is hubris. And hubris is this inflated sense of privilege and power. And in some ways, the tragic hero always thinks that they can somehow alter fate. The idea that this preordained, predestined plan in your life that you have no control of, the tragic hero thinks that they somehow can outwit it, can outplay it, can outmaneuver it, and they can control fate. And unfortunately, that's not an option for humans. We're not able to. So the tragic flaw stems from this hubris, and essentially what this does is it creates an error in judgment and produces a chain reaction, culminating in the catastrophe, which is always in Act 5, and it eventually leads to the hero's downfall. So going back to what our friend said in the video, the hero's downfall is partially his own fault. It is the result of free choice. It's not accident or villainy or some overriding malignant fate. It is their own fault, but there's other issues or other things that have an impact on that decision, okay? And at the end, I would argue, except for Macbeth, in my opinion, the hero remains admirable, okay? So think Brutus. He remained admirable even after what had happened. Hamlet remains admirable. King Lear, I think we'll have to talk about him. Othello, he's a little questionable, but I think Macbeth is the one that I don't know if we can say that he remains admirable. So the tragic fall is not pure loss, even though it oftentimes results in the hero's death. That is one of the other elements of Shakespeare's tragedies, is that it's usually not one or two people that die. It is, there are many people that die, right? Whether they're collateral damage or in the line of fire directly. I mean, when Shakespeare's going to do tragedy, like he's going to do it. He's going to have a lot of victims of this decision. Okay, so this is an interesting one that we're going to consider. The hero's misfortune is not wholly deserved. The punishment exceeds the crime. This, I will say, I believe, does apply to Lear very well. Okay, so the tragic fall is not pure loss. Even though it does result in death, there is an increase of awareness some gain in self-knowledge, or as Aristotle puts it, discovery. I will say that King Lear, it's all about self-realization and regeneration. That is the whole point of this play, to realize even at the end of one's life where you go wrong, where you have inadequacies. That is this realization that he finally comes to. Okay, and then we have the following very fancy Greek terms that hopefully you can use at a very fancy party one day and you'll sound really smart. The peripetia, which is the reversal of their fortune, anagnorisis, the discovery, and of course pathos, having some sort of regret. And this, I think you'll see amplified in King Lear with the idea of this regret. Okay, so he must become aware that his mistake has caused his misery, takes responsibility for his deeds, and even experiences remorse. Okay, there is both internal and external conflict. In King Lear, it's very obvious what his internal conflict is because it comes out in madness. Okay, so these are just a little bit more detail about each of these stages. So here are the character, circumstances, and fortunes. There is going to be some sort of downfall. This is the discovery or the realization, and then of course the moment of suffering. So the classical hero accepts their punishment or their death as a fitting consequence of their actions. So even though pity and fear emerge from tragedy, I do believe that the audience is not left in a state of depression. There is an emotional release at the end. I'm not going to say that all of you are going to end up weeping, but I think this one might get you in the feels a little bit because it is a very emotional ending to the play. What else do I want to mention? So that's about it. The last little bit is about the plot, etc. So I'm going to pause for a second in case somebody wants to pop in to ask a question about this. We're experts on tragedy already. Okay. So this I'll go over. This is your typical dramatic structure. Oh my gosh, I don't know how, whoops. Okay. So imagine that there is a nice triangle here. I'll have to fix that on the original. Why it looks like it was nice there, of course. It's my luck. Let's see if I can fix this. Okay, so every Shakespearean tragedy is divided into 5 acts, and every play contains the following 6 elements. You know, you've got your exposition. This is essentially the conditions at the beginning of the play. The characters are introduced. The time. This is pre-Christian. It's based on some sort of like a Celtic king, but there are anachronisms, and anachronisms are basically the author's references to his time that don't make sense in a pre-Christian time. So there are references like religious references, Christian religious references like crosses and angels, and there's references to the Bible. However, the actual character exists in a pre-Christian time. So do you see how that doesn't quite fit? I will make mention of those as we come to them. But these are the conditions at the beginning of the play. Okay, so we have all the positions, the circumstances, and the relationships to one another. And there's a lot of dynamics here that we have to unpack. Okay, so that correlates to Act 1. Okay, the rising action usually has an exciting force. It's also called a trigger incident. And this is what gets the action going. In our play, it's pretty obvious. It's called the love contest, or that's what it's referred to as. And this is the beginning of the conflict of the play. It always happens in Act 1 or Act 2 because Shakespeare's tragedies really do follow this particular format. And not that we will do this in this class, but technically you could probably read Act 1, 3, and 5 of all of Shakespeare's plays and pretty much get the gist of it. The rising and the falling action are not always as significant. So 2 and 4, and that's where in our play, most of the subplot occurs in Acts 2 and 4. Okay, in Julius Caesar, in Acts 2 and 4, that's where the female characters are introduced. So you could see that Shakespeare's attitude about women, they're not held in very high esteem because they don't occur or they don't have parts in the main action of the play, which is Acts 1, 3, and 5. Okay, so the rising action is a series of events that lead up to the climax of the play, and you're going to notice a progressive intensity and interest in the audience. So the juicy bits start to flow, the stuff that we're like, ooh, where is this going to go? All that kind of good stuff starts happening. The climax is the turning point, okay? So this is where the tragic hero makes that epic mistake that they can't go back from. So what does Romeo do? He kills Tybalt, and you can't unkill someone, so ergo, we just watch his downfall from that point, okay? The falling action. So this is basically the space between the bad decision and the catastrophe, where the bad decision is sort of like all the results from the bad decisions and consequences, they're discovered. The episodes will show both advances and declines in various forces acting upon the hero. Like the rising action, the falling action will involve events in more than one act, like the end of 3 and maybe into the beginning of 5. But you will notice at certain times in Act 4, things will look like they're getting better for the tragic hero, only to have everything fall apart and to crash down awfully by the end. Okay, and then finally we have the catastrophe in Act 5, and this is essentially where the consequences of the hero's actions is going to lead to the hero's death, and that's it. So I attach this. I think it might be a good idea for you guys to fill this out, since you know now that this is Act 1, usually Act 1 or Act 2, Act 2, 3, 4, and 5. And just to highlight the main events, point form, very brief, where do all of these things fit? Okay, any questions about that? Okay. All right, well, that is a typical tragedy. Now we're going to look at King Lear being the odd one out. Okay, so King Lear's plot structure is unlike all other tragedies. While most tragic heroes, so for instance Hamlet, Brutus, Macbeth, Othello, begin their stories with ambitious men who rise to power, make a critical mistake, and fall from grace to a catastrophe, King Lear is different. The play begins with a king at the height of his power, and he makes a critical mistake in the exposition, which leads to his swift decline and plummet into madness by Act 3. Acts 4 and 5 traditionally show the decline of the tragic hero. With King Lear, we watch a turbulent recovery. Okay, so there's peaks and valleys. Compared to other tragic heroes, King Lear doesn't kill or betray anyone, but he is punished beyond the fate of other tragic heroes. Why is this? Well, in Elizabethan times, a king was thought to be anointed by God to be ruler. When King Lear gives up his throne and divides his kingdom, the audience, both watching the play and in the royal court in the play, would have been horrified by this unnatural and unprecedented decision. When you are king until death, literally until you die. It was absolutely unheard of to abdicate oneself. So the audience is left to watch the slow and painful decline. So here we have the exposition in Act 1, and we actually see his decline first, whereas in the traditional sense, you would see their rise to power and then their fall. We're actually going to watch King Lear hit rock bottom by Act 3, where he is fully and completely mad. And then we have moments of lucidity, moments of madness, finally leading us to the catastrophe. Okay, so that's how this one is different from other plays. Now, finally, the last sort of theory for the day that I want to go through, the great chain of being. Okay, so this is the idea of the divine right of kings. Where did the Elizabethan people, and even before that, sort of this is a medieval concept. Where did this come from? Well, it was a way for the clergy, especially in their very corrupt nature, to put everybody in a social, economic, political position where they thought that they should be. Okay, so it's a concept that derived from Aristotle and based on preserving the sanctity of the church or the religious power. Okay, St. Thomas Aquinas in 1263 designed this. The chain was designed to enforce the three estates. So at the time, in 1263, you had three states: the clergy, nobility, and peasants. And what St. Thomas Aquinas did is he had sort of, I guess you'd call it like a hierarchy. And he did this with plants, he did this with animals, he did this with people, he did this with nature. So how, like, you know, icebergs would be like the ultimate in terms of ice, and then lower than that you'd have like a snowball, then a snowflake. I'm joking, that's just an example, but he really did categorize almost everything so people knew their position in society. So if you're a peasant, you are not going to be out of place when you're addressing a noble person, okay? And if you're a noble person, you're not going to go and disrespect a lord, okay? So there is like a status. Its purpose was to maintain the status quo of social structure, because we know that people who are in power, corrupt or not, don't ever want to lose that power. So they have to do things that reinforce their privilege and their power. And everyone has to know their place in the hierarchical order, and their power is not to be questioned. So a unifying principle maintaining the chain of being is rational order and divine love. So each being has an integral role in the chain, which entails a degree of authority and responsibility to the rest of the chain. So as you can see, there really is a dichotomy. And humans, I've highlighted here, are sort of the in-between, because we can choose between being spiritually virtuous, and we can also give in to our sinful physical selves, okay? So we have free choice. We are unlike animals or plants in that way. We have free choice. That's why we're kind of in the middle of this, as you can see. Good at the top, evil at the bottom, and humans are sort of the question mark in the middle, depending on whether you go to the spiritual realm or whether you live your life more in the physical realm. Okay, so as you can see, ultimate order at the top with God, angels, stars, planets. This is the spiritual realm. Elements, like think chemistry. That humans are in between, and then not that animals are evil, but because they don't have free choice or maybe some type of consciousness, awareness, they are below humans in that sense. So this is the physical realm where you have animals, plants, inanimates, and then of course the devil's at the bottom with chaos, evil, good, God, devil, chaos, order. You see how that works. So now more specifically, the medieval and Renaissance worlds inherited a unique worldview in terms of the hierarchical universe ordained by God. Those higher on the chain possess greater intellect, social mobility, and capability than those lower on the chain. That's true of today. People, you know, with education, with privilege, with status, have more access to other things, to jump a social class. People lower on the chain don't have that same opportunity. And essentially anybody higher up on the chain could assert more authority over lower ranks. Not that that's fair at all. Any interruption in the chain creates chaos from that point down. So as you can see, oh, I wish I was on 2 pages. God is at the top, the devil's at the bottom of this page, and in this chain. And we can look at things in 2 different ways. The temporal or the physical world, which would be our world, and then the spiritual metaphysical world. So according to this, God dictates 2. In the temporal world, it is the king, the divine right of kings, right? And in the spiritual or metaphysical world, God determines the Pope. And you can see the hierarchy from here. So you have the Pope, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, lay people, which would be people that are believers but don't have I guess the ability to practice. And then you have sinners, agnostics, and atheists. So people that don't know if God exists and people that don't believe that God exists. This is obviously a very Eurocentric and Christian-centric point of view. This does not represent all people, so I just want to make that disclaimer. And in this sense, you have the temporal and physical world. So this is of time and physical being. Kings, nobles, knights, gentlemen, merchants, peasants, gypsies, criminals. Okay? Obviously some racist implications there. So, do this. I know that's a lot of material to go over, but are there any questions? Anything you want me to make clear? Anything that you didn't know and now you know? Okay, so if you knew everything, why did you make me go off on that tangent for so long? No comment. All right. So I think it's important that as we're reading, you're going to fill out your knowledge of Acts 1, 2, 3, 4. This is going to help you because I've kind of brainstormed, I think, a little bit of what we're going to do for this unit. And we're definitely going to do a creative assignment, a creative writing assignment. We are going to have a quote test, probably about halfway through the play. So after Act 3, we'll do a little quote test. And then I'm debating whether we do, I think we're going to do an oral presentation in this unit, but to be determined. I'm sort of thinking. So most certainly you're going to have a test and you're going to have a creative coming up. So I think it would be good to be making notes, taking quotations and line references down. In the event that you do have to write an essay, you want to know where the good, juicy bits of information are. Okay? Any questions? All right. So I think without further ado, let's get to the play.
Wait, Miss, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So you said we're gonna have a test. Like, how are we gonna do the test? Is it gonna be like a Google form?
No, you know what? I think, well, I would kind of make it maybe not a form, but like a Google Doc where I could, I think it's going to be a quote test. So it'll be like probably a short answer to like a mid-sized paragraph. I still have to work out the details on that. And I would most certainly give you ample notice for when that's coming up. But we also have to get into a little bit of how do we analyze quotes? What are we looking for when we're studying Shakespeare? So we're most certainly not there yet, and I will definitely make sure we take the time to figure out how it's going to work out the best for you. But it probably will be either by Google Form or Google Docs somehow. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And it won't be until after Act 3, so we have to get through most of that. Okay, I see something in the chat. Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so did you know that Shakespeare wrote 2 versions of some of his plays?
Oh.
Well, he did. Okay, there's the folio edition, which is pretty good, but I think I'll show you. It doesn't really matter. The folio edition and the quarto edition. The Oxford School, they do the quarto edition, and that just means that you have the more detailed one. So some of his other plays are missing soliloquies or missing passages. This is the most full version of it. So we always read the quarto versions. Okay, all of this stuff at the beginning, the introductory notes, I know most of you just flip over it to get to the good stuff, but this is the good stuff. So I really recommend that you read it. Okay, you're just responding to that. So the introduction, I would, if you have some time, the synopsis is quite good, but you'll see as we read it. And then there's a little description of the characters in the play. As we get there, I have a lot of notes I'm just going to upload onto Google Classroom, and you can just read through my notes. I have act by act and scene by scene notes but that's, of course, for after we've engaged with the text. There's also commentary, which is really great on all of the acts. If you want an analysis, you couldn't get any more analytical than it's right in the book. Okay, so I would recommend reading that. But I do want to take some time now to go over, okay, the New text, you can look at that in a little description of Shakespeare's verse. Like, this was the original that he wrote. So we're going to do a little lesson on blank verse, rhyme, that kind of stuff, just as a review. I'm sure you've already been familiar with it. Okay, if you'd like to go to the page that says characters in the play, if you don't have your play, do not stress about it. You can just listen, and I will take a break in a few minutes and I'll upload the e-text. Okay, so King Lear, King of Britain. Some of the questions yesterday that we talked about: egomaniac, father, 3 daughters, no son to bequeath his kingdom to. So what he decides to do is he's going to divide his kingdom equally among his 3 daughters, but it's not really equal because he has a favorite daughter who he wants to give the best part of the kingdom to. So 2 problems to start off the play. First is what?
There's no son to
Well, yeah, there's no son, but we can't, I mean, he can't go and have another son now. So that's out of the question. But there's 2 problems with his decision. Do you know what they are? One of them I've already talked about. Take a chance.
It's like not okay for the king to abdicate or to split up the kingdom.
Thank you. Actually, you've hit both. Sabrina, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So 2 things. Yeah, you don't give away your kingdom before you die. That's rule number 1 when you're a king, at least in his time, okay? You cannot give it up. Bad. Second thing, and this I think kind of goes just for general monarchy. What's better, a large kingdom unified or 3 smaller kingdoms divided?
Unified.
Yeah, the
Unified is the way to go, right? You don't want to divide a kingdom, because what happens with a divided kingdom?
That can create conflict between the different kingdoms and stuff.
It sure does. It creates civil war, right? And that is not something that a king would want in his kingdom. So you have to understand that from the very beginning, when this happens, the audience is, oh, and then his royal court is also, oh, right? And what do you do to stop a man who thinks that he is God's representation on earth, divinely chosen? You can't really question that guy, because it's his decision, right? So this is where we encounter the problem in Act 1. Okay, King Lear has 3 daughters. Goneril is the eldest, Regan is the middle child, Cordelia, she's the youngest, and of course she's the favorite. So when he does divide the kingdom, he wants to give the best part of the kingdom to the favorite daughter. Now I will say, we don't really have any context as to what type of situation we are entering here. We don't know about the family dynamic of how Lear interacts with all of his daughters before the play begins. All we see is what happens after. So because of the treatment that some of the daughters give to him, you have to sort of question what the relationship was like. But that's beyond our understanding. That's beyond our knowledge. But that is a great idea for a creative assignment. You provide the details of how we are led into the play. So there's those 3 daughters. The Duke of Albany, he is married to Goneril, and the Duke of Cornwall is married to Regan. So they have husbands. That is significant, okay? As we go, you're going to see that there is a pretty obvious divide between the good and the evil characters. Albany is on the side of good. So I just want to put that out there for you right now. So you associate Albany with being good, so you don't get confused between Cornwall and Albany later. Okay, the Earl of Kent. Kent is Lear's longtime, I would say, dear friend, his counsel, confidant. Kent is also extremely blunt and says what Lear needs to hear, not what Lear wants to hear. And that is problematic for him. The Earl of Gloucester, okay, he is a noble person in Lear's court. He has two sons, Edgar and Edmund. And please forgive me, but I always say the wrong Ed, and I try to get it straight in my head, but I get confused. So Edgar is what you would refer to as, I guess, what he would refer to himself as at this time is legitimate, okay? Edmund is an illegitimate son, meaning that Gloucester had an extramarital affair with another woman, which produced Edmund. Okay, Gloucester had a child with his wife, who's Edgar's mother. Therefore, he is the legitimate child. Okay, these are also very archaic concepts from Shakespeare's time, really not applying to today's life and situation. Okay, who's Gloucester? Gloucester is a noble person in Lear's court. But Gloucester is the father of Edgar and Edmund, and they are part of the subplot. Okay? The Fool is King Lear's jester, and like I said yesterday, he sort of represents the lower class of people, but he ironically is one of the more intellectual people. It's the same as the grave digger in Hamlet. He digs a grave, which would have looked at like a lowly position, but he ironically is also one of the more intelligent characters in the novel. And even Hamlet's kind of like, what? Okay, so it's nice when you get someone of privilege in a higher class that gets put in his place by someone of the lower class. So I always like when that happens. Then there's a few minor characters, Curran, Oswald. There's a few gentlemen. The gentlemen are just sort of generic characters that are present in society, and they represent the common people. So remember we talked about the breakdown of order when the king loses his position, okay? The gentlemen or the common people are just a representation of what life is like for common people at the time. So they are going to describe civil war, chaos, storms, weird things happening. They represent what everybody else is experiencing. Okay. Then there's even more minor, an old man, a doctor, officer, and a herald. Okay, and then we always have knights coming in and out, and servants and that sort of thing. Okay, so I just want to read the context here. I like the, okay, these are good. And also, if you're not sure what's ever going on in one of these plays, there's really good juicy details in the margin. There's just sometimes there's terms that are archaic and we don't understand what they mean. And even in here, there's some references to things that scholars think that are obscure or unknown. So we have to sort of guess what they are. So Gloucester and Kent speak of the division of the kingdom. So we know that this is already happening. Okay. What page is this? I can't really give you a page. It would be page 1, but it's after all of the notes. Okay, so it just says Act 1 on it. I'll give you a minute to get there. It's after all the Roman numerals. No problem. Okay, so Gloucester and Kent speak of the division of the kingdom, and Kent meets Edmund, the bastard son of the Earl of Gloucester. King Lear announces his intention of dividing the kingdom into 3 parts and giving 1 part to each of his daughters. The largest share will be given to the daughter who can say she loves him the most. Okay? So a few problems here. You're combining power, love, position. None of those things really work well together, okay? And what's ironic is that he's going to have each daughter perform this public outpouring of emotion. And whoever sounds like she loves him the most is going to get the best part of the kingdom. But don't forget, he's already reserved the best part for Cordelia. Okay? So he is quantifying love instead of qualifying it. So he wants a big expression of love. But is it genuine? We'll see. Since it's a tragedy, I'm sure you already know it's not genuine. Okay, so we have Goneril is the first to speak, and she is duly rewarded. Regan speaks next and is given her share of the kingdom. But when Lear turns to his favorite daughter Cordelia, who is the youngest of the three, he is very disappointed. Cordelia refuses to flatter Lear as her sisters have done. This puts him in an absolute rage. Lear disowns Cordelia. Now, here's the issue with that. She's unmarried, and she has a lot of suitors. But what do suitors want in this time in order to marry a woman, because women were not valued as much? What is a suitor going to want?
Her father's status?
Status, but what else usually comes with a daughter as like a barter, an exchange for?
Money?
Yes,
Money?
a dowry. Could be money. It could be, 6 pigs. I don't know. But it could be money, privilege, land. Okay. So by disowning her, he removes any opportunity for her to have a dowry. And if she doesn't have a dowry, what man of status is going to want her? No one. So he disowns her as his daughter, says awful things to her, and then she's left to basically fend for herself. And as a woman at this time, it's not really like she has other opportunities, so it's not looking good for her.
Miss, sorry about this, but where is this? I can't seem to find it, Miss.
Okay, the very first page, Act 1, I'm just reading the context, the intro. So you have to skip over all of the Roman numerals. Michaela, what's actually sad to you about that? What was it that I said that was sad? The dowry thing?
Yeah, the fact that that she has to have a dowry and then she's unmarried, so now she has to kind of survive for herself. That's kind of sad.
It is kind of sad. I don't want to ruin it for you, but it gets even worse.
Yeah, I would assume it gets worse, but
Yeah.
like it's already starting not great.
It is. But there's a little twist there. So stay tuned, because there's something good that happens, even though most of it is bad. Okay, so in a rage, Lear disowns Cordelia and distributes her land between Goneril and Regan. So instead of dividing it into 3, he divides it into 2. Kent remonstrates with the king, and Lear banishes him from the kingdom. So Kent, I said, was his advisor, and he really warns him. There's a lot of references to seeing, to sight, and this is not like always literal seeing, but having insight, having awareness, that kind of seeing, okay? And because he does this in front of the whole court, and Lear is already in a fit of madness, he's banished Cordelia, he's banishing Kent, the only 2 people that were really looking out for him, okay? So Cordelia's 2 suitors are called in. So you can see how all of this sort of plays out. She is disowned, then she has 2 suitors there, Burgundy and some other kind of wine from France. We'll find it as we go. So Cordelia has no dowry. Oh, sorry, I missed a spot. And Lear offers his daughter in marriage to the Duke of Burgundy. But Cordelia now has no dowry, and Burgundy rejects King Lear's offer. Okay. The King of France, however, asks to know the reason for Lear's displeasure with his daughter. When he learns the truth, he takes Cordelia as his wife and they leave for France. So at least there's that. There's one guy who sees her for who she truly is, and she may not have said the right thing to Lear when he wanted to hear it, but her intentions are true and good. So you're going to see oftentimes she's associated with light, with white, and with like positive religious symbols like angels. There's a reason for that, okay? So Goneril and Regan exchange a few words together. So you see this exposition, like so much that we have to unpack, okay? The beginning of this scene is a very awkward situation where we have Kent and Gloucester. We're having a conversation, and you'll notice there's not a lot of stage direction in Shakespeare's plays. So there's a lot of unknown of like who enters at what time, where are people standing, does Edmund overhear the conversation between Kent and Gloucester? We don't know. So let's kind of see what you think about, because I think it's important to find out who's present, who's not present, who overhears, where people are sort of set on the stage, okay? So I will need some volunteers to read. Could I have someone read for Kent?
Sure, I'll do it, miss.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Gloucester?
I can read it, miss.
Thank you. I'll just wait painfully with a sad look on my face until you relent to it.
I was trying to say I'll read it, but my mic wasn't unmuting, but it's okay. Sarah can have it.
Oh, classic. My mic wouldn't turn on. You can be Edmund. How about that, Arush?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll yeah. Okay, I'll take Edmund.
Can I have a King Lear, please?
Oh, can I have Lear?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Goneril. Now, I don't want to sound sexist, but I have to say, in my experience, females can read male parts, but when males read female parts, it just creates too much comedic activity. So please don't think that I am being sexist in that statement, but I think it just doesn't work. So if there's some ladies who would like to be the daughters, that'd be great. I need a Goneril.
Miss, I'll do it.
Thank you. Cordelia? Do I have to start like getting a tear forming in my eye and let it slowly run down my cheek until somebody offers? Cordelia?
I can do it.
Thank you. Regan? You don't have that many lines. Oh, Samantha, you put on your mic? Okay, thank you. Have pity on your teacher. I have grade 9s that won't even talk to me, so. And we have Kent, yes? Who is Kent? Oh,
wait,
Jeffrey.
I think Jeffrey, yeah. Jeffrey.
Oh, wait, miss. Oh, sorry. So
That's okay.
wait, are we starting, miss, already?
In just a minute, there's a few more characters that I have to pick. So we have Albany and Cornwall. Who can be Albany? They don't say many lines. If you're not comfortable, this is a good character. You can say a couple of things here and there, participate a little bit. Albany?
I'd be Albany.
Thank you very much. And Cornwall?
I can be Cornwall.
Thank you. I'm going to need Burgundy. Again, small part. You won't come back ever again.
I can do it.
Thank you, Michaela. And that leaves us with France. Not the country, but the King of France. So they just take out King and just put France.
Sorry, what was the name again?
You are going to be Burgundy.
Okay, just making sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. And France. I think that's the last character we need for this scene.
I'll volunteer, miss.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. Okay, let's finally get to the action. So, Kent, when you're ready.
Oh, doesn't the person narrative have to say